The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 12. Murderers. Linus was led along lengthy passages for a few minutes, all of which seemed to blur into a single moment. As he walked, a buzzing noise grew louder and louder until it was audible as the murmur of a crowd. Then, just as the murmur became so loud that it sounded as if it were right above him, they came to a door. When it opened, the first thing Linus noticed was the intense smell of urine which flooded his senses. Linus walked through and found himself in the centre of a large corridor. To his left, he could see a very long and very wide passage that led slowly upward until it rounded a corner and went out of sight. Indeed, it was wide enough for an elephant to walk through. To his right, there was a small wooden door splattered in blood. A trail of both fresh and aged bloodstains led from that door to the last door, which was directly in front of him, on the other side of the corridor. This was a tall sliding double door, and Linus recognised it instantly. Through this door was the inside of the pit. Then it started, the swarm. Like a heartbeat, thudding dull from outside, pulsating the very roof of the tunnel, shaking dust from the ceiling. The swarm grew louder, more intense. The wooden doors shook against the frame. Horns started too, pulsating in time with the drums. He could hear 1,000 people stamping their feet in time with it. And what was once a murmuring crowd was now a screaming, deafening riot. His heartbeat seemed to pound in time with the swarm. A blind panic swelled in his body. Thump, thump, thump. He felt as if he might die of terror right there where he stood. The smell of urine, which he had at first assumed was from the elephants, now made perfect sense as he felt a hot trickle snaking down his leg. He struggled hard to keep his chest from exploding, and then from somewhere behind him 2 guards stepped forward and slid apart the doors. Blinding intense light penetrated deep into his eyes, and he felt a hard shove in his back and stumbled forth into the pure light. He turned, and his eyes began to adjust, just in time to see the wooden doors slap close behind him. The crowd was deafening. This was his city, the society he had once been part of, now all screaming their approval of his violent death. He turned slowly around, knowing what he would see, and there it was, the enemy. But Linus was surprised to find that what he saw as the enemy was not the beast, but the man atop it. He recognised the elephant. It was a younger one, a clumsy one too, and he felt good about that. This was to his advantage. He squinted hard, trying to recognise the rider, but his face was in the shadow of his helmet, and he was too far away in the distance to make it out. It didn't matter. Now, staring across the pit at his enemy, he no longer felt pure terror. Now it was exhilaration and utter immersion in concentration. It moved forward, charging straight at where Linus stood. But Linus stayed planted to the spot. If he moved too fast, the elephant would simply veer its course and catch him at the wall. No, Wesley was right. Agility was his advantage, and Linus now focused his every fibre on bounding to one side when the time was right. As the elephant passed the halfway point, its movements seemed to go into slow motion. And then, with a force like nothing he had ever felt within him, Linus moved aside faster than he had ever dared to believe he could. He was away, sprinting along the curve of the wall as close to it as he could manage, his fingertips brushing along it. When he checked to see where the elephant was, he noticed that it had been halted and pivoted on the spot. This was a skilled rider who apparently knew that the elephant wouldn't be able to veer fast enough to meet Linus at the wall. Linus stopped running and stood still on the spot. The elephant was closer than halfway. Close enough that Linus could see the menacing look in its eyes. It reared its head and trumpeted, but did not move from its spot. It lowered itself into the closest thing to a pouncing stance that an elephant could manage. Linus backed up to the wall, raising his foot behind him and planting it on the wall's surface, his eyes never leaving the elephant's gaze. He'd seen this before, and knew that if the elephant was the first to move, he would be pinned on the wall. And so, without hesitation, or indeed any thought at all, he darted from the spot, pushing off from the wall with his foot, back the same way as he had come. A second later, he heard the elephant collide with the wall not far behind him, and the audience boomed and screamed and gasped, but he didn't look back, for he had gained some ground on the beast now and intended to keep it. He broke from the wall and made to run right across the pit, straight through its centre. If he was correct in his thinking, the elephant would be unstable and clumsy for a second or so after colliding with the wall. And so he took this opportunity to make some real distance on the beast and headed for the opposite side of the pit, the side where he usually sat and watched. But midway across he heard the thumping of the elephant's feet and knew he had misjudged. He would not make it across in time. He peered over his shoulder to see how much distance he had, and gasped to see that the beast was only a few short yards behind him and gaining fast. He darted to the side. But as he did this, the long grey tube, which was the elephant's trunk, caught him around the ankle, sending him to the ground in a tumble. Even as he was falling toward the ground, Linus knew that if he stayed there for more than an instant, a tusk would pin him there, and so he rolled to the side, indeed, just as a tusk slapped onto the stone floor. Without turning to look back, Linus was on his feet and making for the wall's edge yet again, as fast as his feet would carry him. The audience positively thrived, with groans and screams, and Linus pretended in his mind that the applause was for him. When he reached the wall, he turned to see with some relief that the elephant still lingered in the centre of the pit. Behind it, he could see the door through which he'd entered the pit, with the Emperor's grandstand arching above that. There was the Emperor himself, standing at the front, bouncing with glee and excitement, an empty goblet in his hand and wine all down his front unnoticed. Remy stood at the front of the grandstand too, and even Deimos was there. The princess seemed to be the only one still in her seat, although she did seem to be sitting on its very edge. Indeed, all around the pit, thousands of faces watched him with utter intensity. And then, with a pang of disgust, Linus saw the timer, which sat on display on the edge of the grandstand as per usual. It looked as if it had barely run out at all. Linus was horrified. It felt like he'd been outrunning this elephant for hours, but according to the timer, it had scarcely been a minute. Linus was distracted from this thought by sudden movement in the pit's centre, noticing just in time that the elephant was charging directly at him. He took one deep breath and darted to the side, although not as fast as he had managed earlier, and this time the elephant managed to cut him off at the wall. It swung its trunk high at Linus's head, and he ducked beneath it, his head colliding with the elephant's mouth. In the same moment, Linus brought both of his feet up below him and found them planted on the knee of the beast, which swiftly launched him across and against the wall, where he slid to the ground. A puff of air swept his face, and it smelt like dust and blood, and he found he couldn't see properly for it. A tusk came down upon his back, but the blow was softened considerably because it had been intercepted by the wall. He caught a glimpse of the rider, who stared down upon him with utmost fury, and that's when Linus saw with a sudden rush of hatred that it was none other than Crusini himself atop the beast. "I told you you're a dead man, didn't I, boy?" he bellowed. As he did so, Linus took the opportunity of Crusini's lapse in focus, and as the elephant reared its head for another strike, he darted at the gap between the elephant and the wall, which had grown large enough for him to fit through. But before he could make it out the rear end of the tunnel, the elephant had pivoted its rear end to the side, swayed steeply and tipped sideways, the entire length of its body slapping hard against the wall, in an attempt to squash Linus in between. Linus dropped down in time to narrowly avoid it, the impact zone barely an inch above his head. He scrambled between the beast's legs, but it soon noticed that it had missed its enemy and made to crush Linus below its body, collapsing its legs and lowering its body to the ground with a deep thud. Linus dove at the ground and rolled, expecting to feel the full weight of an elephant at any second, but to his astonishment, he rolled away untouched. The audience erupted afresh, gasping and groaning and screaming in horror. When he turned to see the beast, it was in a clumsy kneel, its legs splayed awkwardly in all directions, and its body sort of wedged between the wall and the ground. What's more, he saw that Crusini had been all but dislodged from his seat and hung upside down from the side of the elephant, his leg tangled up in the ropes that bound the seat to the elephant. He was thrashing desperately around, reaching at the ground, and then Linus saw what he was reaching for. the sword, which lay several metres out of Crusini's reach. Linus dashed forward and grabbed the sword, and then made to lodge it deep into any part of Crusini's body he could manage. But as he approached, gripped by sheer fury, swarming into a furious crescendo and feeling of success brewing potent in his heart, he was struck by an urge, a whim which he indulged in and played out as follows. He did not halt his run at Crusini. He continued to dash towards him, but when he reached him, rather than swipe the sword into him, he delivered a kick to Crusini's face, followed swiftly by another one deep into his gut, and a third straight down upon his chin, thoroughly knocking the wind out of Crusini. He then used Crusini's body as a sort of ladder, climbing up it, being sure to use his crotch as a foothold. And then, before he knew it, Linus was sat upon the elephant's neck. He quickly swiped the ropes that entangled Crusini, and as he did so he noticed that he was using his very own sword, and a fleeting smile flashed over his face. Crusini fell to the ground with a thud and a crack which announced that his head had indeed made contact with the stone. Linus knew what to do. His years of never missing a show, of watching the riders and elephants so very closely, would now pay off. With a brush of his hand he instructed the elephant to wrap its trunk around Crusini's leg. Another swift movement of Linus's hand, and Crusini had been tossed high into the air toward the centre of the pit. The beast and Linus trotted toward him, and when they reached him, Linus decided to pin him to the spot with a tusk. But first a sudden realization came to him. He was not in the best position in regards to the Emperor's view of what would surely be the best part. Linus dragged Crusini across the pit, closer to the Emperor's side, and then used his trunk to twist Crusini around, sidestepping around him so that he could see Emperor Frigg, beaming, bellowing and bouncing with overwhelming joy. And then he pinned Crusini. He put a foot lightly across the crook of his lower back and buttock, wrapped his trunk around his leg, and with one swift jerk dislocated it from its tendons. The roar of the crowd was now only for him. Crusini tried to claw his way away. In vain. Linus stomped hard on Crusini's hand, snapping every bone in it. He stomped on Crusini's good leg with a crack. The audience was explosive. He yanked Crusini's good hand clean off and cast it into the air for all to see. He turned Crusini over and slapped his face back into consciousness with his trunk, and then kneeled down on his thigh. His eyes bulged with agony. As he scooped some sand with the end of his trunk and tossed it into Crusini's eyes, Linus marvelled at how precise the movements of the elephant were. The elephant seemed to know what Linus was thinking, as if it were an extension of his own body. He grabbed Crusini about the neck and pulled him limply along the ground from side to side, the elephant's ears flapping about like a couple of useless wings. And then, as the light seemed as if it were just about to flicker out of Crusini's eyes, he stomped once, with all of his might, onto his neck and jaw. It was all over. Crusini's body lay lifeless in a mess of bloody sand and splintered fragments of bone all around. The audience was an utter riot. Linus could see that up on the grandstand, even Commander Deimos applauded his efforts. After quite a long while of joining in with the ovation, Emperor Frigg raised his hand for quiet, but it did not come. Remy let out a crack from his thundersword, but even that didn't settle the audience, who cheered on and on for what seemed like 5 minutes. Eventually the wooden doors slid open and 2 guards rushed forwards. They were armed with swords sheathed at their waists, and they looked alarmingly angry. And that's when it dawned on Linus that he had just killed a very arrogant but otherwise innocent palace guard. He was now a murderer. He had now committed a crime punishable by elephant execution. And upon this realization, the grin on his face diminished into a look of heart-wrenching disappointment. Through the doors came a third man, trailing a few paces behind the other 2, and Linus recognized him instantly. It was Commander Deimos. He dismounted, dropping graciously down the elephant's side. He clenched his sword between his teeth and put his hands in the air to allow the men to take him into custody without fuss. But they did not. They ran past him, straight to the mangled body that was once Crusini, and dragged the thing away. Deimos approached, walking purposefully. Well, well, Linus, he said, a smirk upon his lips. I think you'd best come with me. As they made their way back through the wooden doors, the crowd still applauding, they crossed paths with a man who hurried forth to attend to the beast, which stood indifferent in the pit, swaying its trunk from side to side. Through the corridors they swept, the commander dragging Linus by his elbow. Where are we going? What's going to happen now? Asked Linus. I don't know. No one knows. The decision lies with the Emperor alone, and no doubt he will deliberate for some time before making it. But where are we going? For now, I'm taking you somewhere to await the Emperor's decision. No more words were spoken as they swept along the corridors, up sets of stairs and through doors that grew increasingly ornate as they climbed higher. At one point, they crossed through an enormous hall with a magnificent sculpted roof which towered above, unimaginably high. Occasionally they passed the odd guard who had been left with the unfortunate job of guarding the palace during the rest day show, but even as they begged Deimos for details of what was happening, asking why he was in the palace and who this boy was, Deimos walked briskly onward without a word, until finally, in a corridor lined with 100 identical doors, they stopped. The door they had stopped at had the number 55 on it, and Linus stepped through it, and he found himself in a very simple bedroom, containing little more than a bed and a small dresser. Sunlight shone through a small square window at the very top of the far wall. I do not pretend to know your fate, boy. Today you killed a good soldier and an excellent rider, albeit by sheer luck, but nevertheless you did it. You killed a royal servant of the palace, and for that you deserve severe punishment, said Deimos from the threshold. But I will say this. You have nerve beyond that of some of our fiercest warriors. The door slammed closed and clicked fast to the spot with a jingle of keys, and just like that, Linus was alone in a small room, left to fret about his fate yet again.